Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, I'm going to, perhaps slightly out of sequence, talk about the context of Newton in the Enlightenment, going from, beginning with the paper of February 1672, going all the way up to the triumphs of Lagrange and Laplace. But I want to remain true to some extent to the title of the talk, which is about the role, the nature of Newtonian science in the French Enlightenment. The notion of Enlightenment is complex. The notion of Newtonianism is extremely complicated. I think some years ago, as anyone who does history of science would understand, the notion of Newtonianism was dismantled. I don't use the term deconstructed, but it was shown beyond any doubt that there is no such thing as Newtonianism. There's no one essence of Newtonianism. Newtonianism is to some extent what people make of it, and it's a pointless exercise to try and identify elements of it. As for Enlightenment, there's a vast enterprise directed towards trying to define what Enlightenment is, and I'm not here to do that, except to say that on different sides of the channel, Newton serves very different purposes, as we've heard. I think it's very hard in England in the 18th century. I use that instead of Britain. It's hard to find radicals who see something very significant in Newtonianism for their cause. On the other hand, conservative Anglican, conservative Church of England people, I think quite reasonably see new advances in natural philosophy, particularly Newtonianism, as a corroboration of their general view, which is based on the argument from design. Every new little thing you find about the human body, every new intricate mechanism seems to corroborate the fact, as they see it, that this is a world of intelligent design. If you go across the channel, I think it's quite hard, and we've looked, it's quite hard to find conservatives who are happy with Newtonianism, and I'll try and explain why that is. Newton is quite a dangerous figure. On the other hand, obviously he is the darling. Indeed, he is the divinity in some sense for many people throughout the Enlightenment. I think incongruously he explodes many shibboleths of the Enlightenment because he is such a genius, he is so great. He sort of withstands exactly what it is that he's supposed to represent in terms of the finiteness of human reason, the extraordinary adequacy of ordinary human reason to grasp the divine. I'd also say, before we start, Newtonianism, the exact sciences, is not all of science. It's not all of natural philosophy in the Enlightenment. There are the historical sciences, which many people, many writers on this period would say are the dominant features of mid to late 18th century science. Stuff gets historicized. The life sciences, the limits of time are burst or exploded. We no longer believe that the world was created on the 23rd of October or the evening before, to be more precise, 4004 BC, as Archbishop Usher said. After Buffon and others, we're talking about tens, hundreds of thousands of years, and maybe, if you're really daring, millions of years. And of course, at the end of the century, we find that cosmology takes on board, it embraces that kind of historicization in things like the Kant-Laplace nebula hypothesis. So, Newton and France. The first wave, he publishes his great paper on light and colours in 1672. He has a very pleasant exchange with Gaston Paris, a French Jesuit. He has a less pleasant experience when the great French experimentalist Edmé Mariotte is unable to confirm or replicate Newton's claims about what happens when you put a ray of light through a series of prisms. They do not obstinately retain their colour, as Newton said they did. The Principia of 1687, of course, does change things. Newton acquires not exactly acolytes, but admirers in the form of Pierre Varignon, The Marquis de l'Hôpital, very famously, who asks in a very famous phrase whether Newton is a man. He puts this question to John Arbuthnot in the mid to late 1690s. You know, does he eat, live, drink, sleep, and breathe like other men? And Arbuthnot said he puts himself on a level with all mankind, which was not exactly true. Newton was made a foreign member of the Academy of Sciences in 1699, but as the great French chemist Geoffroy said to Hans Sloane, Newton seemed to have despised that honour. Nevertheless, after optics comes out, we've known for some time, thanks to the work of Henry Gerlach, that Newton's works were read and translated in 1705, so that's a translation of the 1704 Optics. When Opticae comes out, translated by Samuel Clarke, when that comes out in 1706, it's a Latin version of the text, and therefore it is susceptible to a much broader audience. And précis of that text are read out in the Academy in 1706 to 7. There is interest in Newton, and those of you that are fascinated by these sorts of details will know that in 1699 John Arbuthnot met Nicolas Malebranche, and Malebranche said that he was a great admirer of Isaac Newton. So there is admiration for Newton, despite some of the more absurd doctrines that Newton is held to have put forward, such as universal gravitation. It is as if it is indeed the case that the appropriators of Newton's works in France can cut up bits of Newton into the bits they like and the bits they don't like. In 1712 to 13, it becomes incumbent on Newton to make interest in France, because his dispute with Leibniz over the invention of the calculus, and indeed a whole series of metaphysical contexts, is exploding. It's taking off. It's being promoted by a number of people for nefarious interests. It's also being hotly defended on both sides, as we know, by Leibniz's bulldog, Johann Bernoulli, on the one side, and by Newton's ape, John Kyle, of Oxonian descent, Scottish, but he's at Oxford, on the other. And Newton needs French disciples, and he suddenly learns to love the French in about 1712, somewhere towards the end of 1712. And he makes interest with Pierre Varignon, he makes interest with the Académie des Sciences, of which, of course, he is an eminent foreign member. He gives presentations of the 1713 Principia to Bignon, to Varignon, and to one or two other people, including Jacques Cassini, whose work he has problems with. He's the great geodesist cartographer. And we jump 2 years later, with the peace dividends, if you like, after the peace treaty of Utrecht, the end for, I think, the longest period of war between the French and the British in the 18th century. There's only one decade when they're not at war, and it's in the 1720s. In 1715, a deputation of French people come over, the Chevalier de Levis, Raymond de Montmort, a whole series of other people come over to imbibe Newtonianism. There are wonderful stories told by the Abbé Conti, the Venetian nobleman, about what Newton does in terms of giving access to these French potential acolytes. They are shown for the first time a replication of the crucial experiment by Jean-Théophile Desaguliers, one of the Huguenots we were talking about earlier on. In fact, he is the key man, the key representative evangelist of Newton's works. They're shown an example of, they're shown actually the very copy of Newton's 1669 De Analysi. And there's a wonderful account by Conti where he says that amongst the group of French and Dutch people, Edmund Halley and others got hold of the copy of De Analysi, and they showed the foreign visitors just how old it was. They showed them the brown patina on the manuscript. What Newton is doing, as his wont, is showing just how long ago it was that he invented the calculus. There should be no doubt that that date of 1669 on the top of it, although we now know it's written afterwards, there should have been no doubt that that was written when the date says it was. And then I think, finally, in this early stage, after a long series of negotiations and blandishments from very, very major French scholars and diplomats, Newton agrees to allow Pierre Coste to translate his optics, and the great lavish French edition of 1722 becomes a testament to Newton's work in optics. Now, whether he's accepted by the French yet is, I think, a moot point. Some people accept him and some don't. There is no general acceptance until another 30 or 40 years, I think. There's Malebranche, there's Varignon, and there is, that's actually from 1715, so that's exactly the Newton that the visitors saw when they went to London in 1715. That's Newton, in case you wondered who that was. It's a fantastic picture, one that isn't very often seen. We jump forward, of course, to Newton's death. Voltaire is around, even if he's not at the funeral. And Newton's eloge, the elogium, is written by the permanent secretary to the Academy, Bernard de Fontenelle. And it's something that I think is a magnificent piece of prose. There are, in fact, five separate English translations produced within a month of the French edition appearing, and they are each of them bestsellers. Fontenelle's job is to compare and contrast the French genius Descartes with the English genius Isaac Newton, and I think he does it quite superbly, as you would expect if you see the man's other writings. Descartes was great in his time. He had a very strong imagination. You have to put people in their own times. They are sui temporis, of course. Newton has done great things. We don't like attraction because it's absurd. But on the other hand, he is a great man, and he was, of course, a foreign member of the Academy. Fontenelle does a great piece of work. I mean, after all, one of the things he's trying to do, he's trying to negotiate, to use that hideous term, the sort of fracture within natural philosophy between the mixed mathematical sciences and the physical, philosophical branch of natural philosophy, whose goal is precisely to do what Aristotle and Descartes did, which is to propose physical causes of events in the world. For people like Fontenelle and for many, many Frenchmen, including Malebranche, Castel, many of Newton's friends and enemies, Newton is not a physicist, he's a mathematician, because that's how they read, that in a sense that's how they save Newton's comments about not feigning hypotheses. For people like Leibniz and Christian Huygens and all the others, it's absurd, it's a dereliction of philosophical duty to not state what the causes of phenomena are. That's not doing science. So therefore, they see Newton as simply a mathematician, a brilliant one at that. Malebranche's comments, I think, are particularly interesting in this regard. But Fontenelle is dealing with that problem. And I think what he's saying to his, to the younger French scholars who I'm sure he knows are emerging out of the Newtonian woodwork is be careful what you talk about if you are going to talk about things like universal gravitation. It smells very much like an occult quality. It's interesting, I think, we don't have time to go into great detail, but there are three Frenchmen in London at the same time in early 1728. They're very famous. Voltaire, I won't say much about Voltaire because we'll hear more about him. Pierre Maupertuis is in England in early 1728, as is Montesquieu. And Montesquieu apparently ostentatiously goes around London with a copy of Fontenelle's Eloge in French. That doesn't mean he's a disciple of Newton or of Fontenelle, but he's interested in Newton. Newton is the talk of London in early 1728. Maupertuis is more interesting, as we'll see in a minute. He's not interested in Newton, we think, when he goes across in early 1728, but he certainly is when he leaves 3 months later. And he becomes the dominant Newtonian, I think even more than Voltaire in the 1730s. Let's go forward. Maupertuis in 1732 is shifting his allegiance from Johann Bernoulli, the great Swiss disciple of Leibniz who we've come across. He's shifting his allegiance over to Sir Isaac, and Bernoulli doesn't like it one bit. That allegiance is signalled in his great work, which sold only about 200 copies, of 1732, the discourse on the different shapes of heavenly bodies. It's as that work is coming out, in fact it's before that work is coming out, that Voltaire recognises, first of all, that Maupertuis is a kindred spirit, an admirer of England. And of course, England means a lot more than just natural philosophy to these people. He's an admirer. Voltaire understands that Maupertuis is an admirer of Newton, but Maupertuis is also a brilliant and gifted mathematical physicist. And so throughout 1732, the key person for Voltaire is Maupertuis. There's a substantial correspondence between them, as Mary Terrell points out in her great work on Maupertuis. And it feeds into Voltaire's work in his Lettres. I mean, it's waiting for Maupertuis to tell him what to say that, as it were, delays the Lettres by a little bit. But those two are the major people. We've heard already about the Lettres and the Éléments, so I won't say much about that, other than, of course, the scandal of the Lettres. The very high praise given to toleration, religious toleration in England, the condemnation, the very peculiar treatment of Pascal in that book, and also the denunciation of Descartes are things that upset the authorities in Paris, and so he has to run to Cirey. Again, as most of you know, Francesco Algarotti arrives in Cirey in 1735, and how does one put this? He constitutes an intellectual ménage à trois, culminating in his book Newtonianism per les dames of 1737, which is translated into English and French the following year. Algarotti becomes a great popularizer of Newton, but it's a very superficial book in comparison with Maupertuis' book, and certainly in comparison with the Éléments. While all this is happening, French Newtonians are going all over the world. In 1735, a group of académiciens leave for Peru, La Condamine, Godin, Bouguer. They soon fall out. La Condamine and Godin hate each other. They fight like cat and dog, it is said. And they go away and create two separate expeditions in what's now Ecuador, obviously because it's on the equator. Maupertuis takes an even more gilded group to Lapland that requires the permission of the Swedish authorities. They take Anders Celsius with them. It's made up of a cleric, the Abbé Outier, the very young scholar Pierre Lemonnier, Alexis Claude Clairaut. Maupertuis is at the helm. And very quickly, in early 1737, they determine that the Earth is as Newton said it was. That is, it is shaped like an onion. This is an oblate spheroid, and not a prolate spheroid, as the Cartesian geodesic cartographer dynasty, the Cassini, had said it was. The impact of this is extraordinary. Perhaps it's equally extraordinary in science and also in the cultural sphere. Maupertuis comes back as a great hero. It makes his name. Remember that previous work, which is the first great work of popularization in France, had sold only about 200 copies. This work, he writes up the voyage to Lapland. It has some beautiful images, some great pictures of the Lapps, and some very nice images of the triangulations they took on the meridian in Tornion-Joki, in the Gulf of Bothnia. It makes him a star. And there he is. That's a great picture with his hand flattening the earth. Le grand aplatisseur de la Terre et de Cassini. That is Francesco Algarotti. That is Pierre Lemonnier. I couldn't find a young, youthful picture of him. If I recall correctly, he's only about 18 when he goes on the trip to Lapland. If anyone can correct me on that, that would be very helpful. But this is obviously a much older picture of him. That is the great man himself, Alexis Claude Clairaut. These are images in Maupertuis' 1738 work of the triangulation at Bothnia. The other event didn't fare so well. This is a picture in a much later text by La Condamine of the murder of a French surgeon. It takes place in a top gallery, and when it says A at the top, a French surgeon is murdered in the Amazon. And again, some of you may know the extraordinary story of the Peruvian expedition, which lasted for, in La Condamine's case, it lasted for 25 years. The others got back in the mid-1740s, 10 years after they left. That is Pierre Bouguer, the great, the father of naval architecture, who models his writings on the Newtonian system. Now we jump forward a little bit to the early 1750s. In fact, we could jump back to the late 1740s in Paris, where you have a group of people who meet. They don't meet regularly as a foursome, but they all know each other. And they are Condillac, Rousseau, Diderot, and D'Alembert. Condillac becomes the inspiration for obviously for sensationalism. He becomes the chief exponent of anti-systematic thinking. Although those of you that work on La Métrie will also know that at the same time, La Métrie is denouncing Newtonianism as yet another system that will soon fade, and he lambastes the idolatry of Newton. But La Métrie is living in a separate world, I think, in many, many different ways. What matters for us is what goes on in the Encyclopédie. And there are two different Newtons in the Encyclopédie. In fact, Newton doesn't really appear at all, except in a very strange section which is entitled Woolsthorpe or Woolstrope. But the Newtonianism, that is the appeal to Newton, appears very briefly in writings by Diderot, and perhaps more extensively in others of his writings. Diderot is interested in playing up the experimentalism of Newton. He is unhappy, he's not au fait with the rational mechanics that stands for or passes as Newtonianism in the middle of the 18th century. By far the most interesting, you've got 5 minutes, okay. By far the most interesting piece comes from D'Alembert. D'Alembert's preliminary discourse is the famous piece of writing that represents the Enlightenment thinking on science. perhaps better than anything else, although of course it is as idiosyncratic as anyone else's. It appears at the front of the first volume of the Encyclopédie. What does D'Alembert say? He says the Enlightenment is about science. Science stands for reason. Science stands for progress. Science is useful, particularly analytic mechanics. The sort of science he thinks Newton did will be the thing that unifies all the sciences. That's very, very important for D'Alembert. Newton himself as a person is very difficult for D'Alembert to manage because D'Alembert wants to talk about reason as something that's available to all clever people, but Newton seems to be different because he invented the correct method. He banished, and he gets this from Condillac, he banished conjectures and hypotheses, and he developed a geometry, the calculus, and an experimental method that was adequate to the real world. Okay, just rushing on. There is D'Alembert in 1753. There is Diderot in 1767. Just picked it because it's a great picture. This is the Cochin's frontispiece to the Encyclopédie. It's worth just pointing, if I can, to the figure here. This is the most significant image of Enlightenment reason, I think. The woman in the veil is Truth, who's being lit from behind by the light of the Enlightenment. Reason and philosophy are trying to pull the veil off her so that truth is made available to everyone else. The person with the bouquet of flowers is imagination. And what that tells you is something I think very interesting. I should also add that on the same side as the imagination is memory. What this tells you in the view of Cochin, reason and philosophy are conquering the imagination, just as Sir Isaac said it was. Memory is being relegated to a much lower position, side by side with theology and history. What's interesting in the case of D'Alembert is D'Alembert does not relegate the imagination, but sees it as something that's a necessary adjunct to reason. Imagination should not be extirpated. You can't extirpate it, but it should be disciplined by reason. And there are two different views again of the role of reason and the imagination. I just, by way of a matter of fact, arguably the most significant issue for the final acceptance of Newton is the correct prediction of the return of Halley's Comet in January 1759, which just comes within a month of the predictions made by Clairaut and others. Condorcet. There are many Newtons in this period. The crowning glory of Newton is perhaps that many different people like Hume, Turgot, Condorcet represent themselves as the Newtons of their own sciences, of the human sciences, of philosophy, of political economy, and so on and so forth. Newton's method is, people attempt to transplant, I think almost entirely unsuccessfully, Newton's method into these other domains. And then right at the end of the century, the two greatest works that one might say for the last time on Newtonian are produced by Joseph Louis Lagrange and also Pierre-Simon Laplace, who, as Robert Fox showed over 40 years ago, created something that Robert called Laplacian physics. Final bit, there is Laplace, there is Lagrange, who's Italian-French, comes to Paris 1787, publishes his great work the next year. So the Enlightenment. I just wanted to conclude by saying that there is that Newton is an important symbol of reason for people of different religious hues or irreligious hues in France. He's a hero for Voltaire. I mean, towards the end of his life, Voltaire sees Newton quite correctly as a free thinker. In his work, God and Human Beings, Newton is placed in the same pantheon as Toland, Collins, Tyndall, and a whole series of other people. And that is because Newton used reason to destroy the mystery of Trinitarianism. I think coming into this is, in this period in the 1780s, just at the very moment when Lagrange and Laplace show what can be done with Newton. You know, Laplace removes those final inequalities that made it impossible to understand the details of the interactions between the planets. At that very moment, you begin to see the problems with fitting this genius, this non-human great man into the system that supposedly derives from him. There's a great essay that Moti Feingold talks about in his book, The Newtonian Moment, by Louis-Sébastien Mercier, the great proto-science fiction writer, where Mercier fantasizes about what happens to Newton's brain when he's asleep. Is it the case that the imagination and the cauchemar take over? And what happens when he wakes up? Does reason then suddenly sort of come back again and do what reason does? And of course, many of you will know the greatest tribute to Newton is to place Newton at the head of a religion, which is what many writers do from the 1780s onwards. The most exciting of these is Étienne Louis Boulet, who published a number of now famous pictures, their proposals for a cenotaph for Newton, which presumably would be in Paris. Anyway, that is one picture. These are very, very large. Those are trees on the outside of the dome. And they are extraordinary. They're tributes to the great man himself. That's what it would have looked like inside, with the Enlightenment blazoning light. There were holes in the roof, by the way, to allow light to come in and to allow Newton's genius to shine outwards. I'll just finish with a wonderful image that was created by Robert Guillaume Dardel in 1782, which is supposed to be a tribute to Descartes' dismissal of the dark vapors of superstition. And this is Descartes arising out of those dark clouds that becloud and make human beings immature. This, of course, 2 years before Kant's great essay on the maturity of human beings. But at the bottom of that, there is a light coming from here, and the light's shining up. And even as Descartes is extricating himself from the clouds of superstition and ignorance, there is a force from the south which is going to blast away not just Descartes, but also all the clouds of superstition that surround him. And of course, that light comes from Newtonian physics. Thank you.
Which is the difficulty in his case on Voltaire, being sort of Anglophile during a difficult period of relation between the two countries. But again, there's a discourse that we've talked about emerging here during the whole of the 18th century. Must sit athwart the fact that politically we have these two polities which are different sorts of directions of antagonistically. Do we have here a story of a science narrative that is completely separate from the political narrative? Or if not, how do they interact, if at all?
Well, they act in complicated ways, and I think sometimes when you read history of science texts, they're written, even when they try to be contextual, it's as if they forget that England, Britain and France are at war with each other, which makes, for example, correspondence in most of the periods we're looking at extremely difficult and fraught with danger for many of the people concerned. You mentioned Schank, and Schank has shed light on some of the complexities involved in French politicians of different commitments displaying their allegiance to Newton. Because I think Newton comes to stand for free thinking. He's a Protestant, of course. As his anti-Trinitarianism comes to the fore, then of course he becomes another problem. He's particularly a problem in Britain, but he becomes a problem for the Orthodox, which is that his hatred of the Trinity, I think, becomes known to more and more people throughout the 18th century. He remains, the most potent symbol, I think, for a particular brand of French anti-clericalism that you don't get in Britain. Not until later on in the 18th century. The form of anti-clericalism in Britain is different. It doesn't really exist in the radical, for conservatives, hideous way that it exists in France. There's always a God there somewhere, I think, in Britain. But that's not the case in France, and Newton is a very, very powerful person to have. I'd just say one other thing, of course, Newton, it is an issue that one or two people might like to discuss as to whether people like Lagrange and Laplace are, or if you go back, Euler or anyone else, are Newtonians in any sense. I mean, I think that the more recent historiography has, I think, quite rightly pointed out that they may have nailed their colours to the mast of Newton in some sense, but the term Newtonianism doesn't do any work for us. I mean, what you see in Lagrange, but to a lesser extent in Laplace, but what you see in Lagrange has nothing to do with what Newton's doing. This is light years beyond anything that Newton could have imagined, notwithstanding anything his disciple said about Newton having hinted everything that could ever possibly be said about science.
Great thought. And other thoughts, I'm sure, from the audience here. Yes, yes.
Just on this question of superstition, Newton has an point of superstition, because it's hard to see how this interpretation of him as not a natural philosopher, just a mathematician, is related to that. But is it that the prestige of mathematics combined with anti-Trinitarianism is extra force to anti-Trinitarianism?
For whom?
For the French who treat him as a foe of superstition.
Yes, he is the... I think what's problematic for them, and this is where we do get into the realms of Jean-Baptiste Biot and other commentators in the 19th century. What's problematic is that Newton does do work, devoted his life to working on prophecy and chronology. Now that's very difficult to fit into the system. And the French, like many Brits, would prefer to ignore all that stuff that appeared in the aftermath of his death. I mean, I think in defense of Jean-Baptiste Biot, I mean, Biot makes very serious efforts to read this stuff. I mean, he's one of the very first French people to read Newton's observations. And he takes it seriously enough to say that there are some very peculiar assumptions that Newton makes in his work. So the French Enlightenment view of Newton's interest in chronology and prophecy would be that it was the work of a dabbler, a senile person who, as Biot then showed, had gone mad in 1693. But if you read it carefully, as Biot did, you can see that this is no dabbler. This is a person who believes some of the sort of hideous anti-Catholic stuff that lies just under the surface. And Biot again brilliantly points out, which I agree with, that this is because Newton is somebody who lives a hell of a long time. He's really somebody of the 1640s, 50s and 60s who happens to live on into the Augustan age and believes the same stuff that he believed 70 years earlier.
Two things. One on Lagrange and that being what it was Leibniz, Newton.
Yeah.
Of course, the key thing there is his use of a variational principle, which is going more back to Leibniz than to Newton. That's more of a comment.
Yeah.
But the question is, to what extent did the French Enlightenment take inspiration from Galileo? Because for me, Galileo is just fantastic in a way with introducing precise mathematical descriptions of motion, and this wonderful saying of Leibniz, he that attempts natural philosophy without geometry is lost. Did that appeal much to the French Enlightenment?
It appeals, but in the pantheon, Galileo is only on a par with Christian Huygens. Now, you could explain that by the fact that Huygens was president of the Academy, when in the late 60s and early 70s. I think it does, serious service to what Huygens does in the Horologia Musculatorium and elsewhere. No one doubts Galileo's triumphs, but what Newton's done, what Newton's done eclipses that or unifies that, and moreover, Newton has presented a method that is potentially transportable to all sciences, to all knowledge. I think it's interesting. We were talking about the imagination early on, but those rules of method derive from Newton's own internal practices as a radical Protestant, I think, where he's very, very distrustful and seeks to contain and tame his own imagination. So that's why you see that towards the end of his life in the drafts that he writes, discussions of idolatry, the imagination, Leibnizian metaphysics and hypotheses are all kind of bundled up in this id that is writing this vicious series of assaults on Leibniz. Galileo, he didn't produce a method. He went some way towards mathematizing nature. It was Newton who showed that there was a much more general law that united Keplerian mathematics in the cosmos with terrestrial mathematics of a Galilean kind. So why look back to the Italian when you've got the Englishman? Who, by the way, whose works are... Galileo is useful, of course, because he represents freedom of thought in a most obvious level in terms of his incarceration, his house arrest. But Newton does something more than that. Newton is courageous, hardworking, brilliant in the realms of experiment and mathematics, which of course Galileo is not seen to be until the 1960s. Galileo's experimentalism is not taken seriously until the 1960s.
Well, when Rob, you said nobody doubts Galileo's genius, we had a dissent from the front row, so
right.
I'll bring you right in. Go ahead.
Well, sorry, that's not the question I was going to ask, but I can discuss it if you want. Can I ask what I was going to ask? You seem to be rejecting the idea that there's an essence of Newtonianism. But on the other hand, you seem to be claiming that Newtonianism is accepted either with the... Sorry, can't hear.
Sorry, just stand up and speak up.
Shall I repeat all that? Go on. You seem to be rejecting the idea that there's an essence of Newtonianism, or you can pin it down in any way that's useful. But on the other hand, you seem to be claiming that Newton or Newtonianism accepted after the ablateness of the Earth successful prediction, or after Halley's Comet. Now, in the first issue, in fact, Huygens, the Cartesian, predicted ablateness. Cassini predicted levelness. Okay, so that's not a crucial experiment, and whether the Comet was a conversion, I don't know. With respect to the second, Halley's Comet, the Principia didn't predict it dynamically, it only did some curve fitting. But even if we take that as a success, in 1770, Euler is solving one of the lunar problems using anti-Newtonian stuff, and it's accepted by the Paris Academy. So, Laplace then gave a Newtonian solution later to this lunar problem. So you could claim perhaps there was a conversion then. What do you mean by Newtonianism, and when do you think there was accepted in France? Or your claim?
well, as I tried to show, it means lots of things to different people. After people emphasize different sorts of things, optics takes a while to become accepted. I think the general view is that Newtonian optics, so the doctrines plus the approach, are accepted in about 1717, 18, where the first replications of Newton's works are accomplished in Paris. There's clearly an acceptance. The French do not accept Newton's his notion of attraction. They never accept that. I'm not sure if they do now. Whatever. But in the period under review, they don't accept it. I think the late 1730s. Perhaps in the most useful comparison is the sort of relatively sudden switch to accept Copernicanism by elites in the 1620s, 30s, and 40s. Whereas before that, there isn't very much. It happens much faster, I think, in France in the late 1730s and early 1740s. But there are still anti-Newtonians like Montesquieu's friend Castel. I mean, Castel begins by really detesting Newton's writings, thinking that what he's done is a kind of monster. It's neither really physics nor mathematics, but it's monstrous. But then in the early in the 1730s and early 40s, I mean, he writes quite vehemently against it. And Shanker's talked about the backgrounds to that. It would be impossible to, I think, isolate some essence de Newton. It's always something that, I hate to use the word construction, but it's always something that is kind of agreed by a consensus after a brief period of time. So, for example, after Condillac and D'Alembert, Newton is once again the person who has quelled systems. I mean, there's a real problem, of course, for people who follow Newton in that this seems to be a systematic destroyer of systems, and that's the claim that La Mettrie and then later Goethe will make, which is that here this great system destroyer is only destroying systems so that he can make his own system, the great apocalyptic end-of-time system to end all systems. Exactly. So I think what we have to look is a sort of fluid, dynamic, changing conception of Newton, which is enjoyed by different people throughout or held by different people throughout the century. Because the problem with the older way of looking at it was somebody came up with a definition of Newtonianism, and there were always so many qualifications and falsifications or counter instances that it made no sense. First of all, it obviously wasn't what Newtonianism was, and secondly, it showed definitively that you couldn't use the term to actually explain anything. It had no utility, which is what D'Alembert wanted from his work.
We've got time for just a quick one right back there.
Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting. I mean, it's an account of the reception of Newton in France. Of course, I'm interested in the converse problem. How were these Enlightenment figures received back in Britain? Voltaire, but also maybe particularly Lagrange and Lagrangian mechanics. It's just a curiosity, but was it seen as the ultimate development of the Newtonian mechanical system as a branch of analysis? Was that received immediately as such, or were there... just generally, what is the reception of all these French thinkers back in the UK?
I think there really is a problem. Let's take seriously the idea. I mean, Lagrangian mechanics is difficult. It has to be passed on by personal contact, by tuition that takes place over a long period of time. You have to probably be quite young. You have to be something like a proto-prodigy, like Clairaut, Maupertuis, D'Alembert. They all were. I mean, I like, the idea of prodigies as people who are exposed to this from a very, very early age, say 7, 8, 9. That's very important for imbibing these and passing on in the form of discipleship, sort of Leibnizian, Bernoullian, Eulerian forms of analysis. But of course, the English can't get over, the British can't get over from what, 1793 to 1802. They come over in 1802 for a few months with the Peace Treaty of Amiens, and then they're at war again until 1815. And what you see is in the standard story, which I think is true, is that a group of young undergraduates in Cambridge decide that they love the French way of doing things because it's much better than the hidebound, old-fashioned Newtonian fluxional system. That system is no longer adequate to the kind of experimental science that's being done in the late 18th, early 19th century. So a group of people, including Herschel, Babbage, and others, set out, and William Whewell is involved in it, they set out to master the Lagrangian system. And they do, and in 1821, 1822, it's incorporated as an alternative to students who are doing the tripos in Cambridge. That's the story. But there are very good political, geopolitical reasons why it takes a long time for Lagrangianism to make its way across.
Well, I have to say that will never happen here, since the syllabus reform never happens in Australia. But on that note, I think we should, we've had a fantastic paper, a wonderful discussion, and a great morning. So thank you, Rob, thank you all.